There is a moment that arrives in the life of every fixer, every rescuer, every person who has ever been called so strong. A moment when the phone stops ringing, and instead of relief, they feel terror. If that sentence made something in your chest tighten, stay with me. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about other people. It is a mirror. And most people spend their whole lives refusing to look into it. We are taught that being needed is the same thing as being loved. We are taught that if we are the one everyone calls at 2 in the morning, the one who always answers, the one who always shows up, then we matter. But nobody tells you what happens to a person who has built their entire identity on being indispensable. Nobody tells you what happens the day that identity is finally taken away. This is a story about that day. About what it costs to be everyone's emergency contact, and what it takes psychologically to finally stop. By the end of this, you will understand why the most exhausted people in any family, any friendship, any workplace, are rarely the weakest ones. They are usually the strongest ones, quietly collapsing under a role they never actually chose. And you will understand something else, something almost nobody wants to admit. The rescuer is not always healing the people around them. Sometimes, without knowing it, the rescuer is only healing an old wound in themselves, using other people's crises as a stage. This is not a story about weakness. It is a story about a mask worn so long that a person forgets it is a mask at all. Let's begin. There is a concept in depth psychology called the persona, the face we present to the world, the role we play so consistently that eventually we stop remembering there was ever a self underneath it. For some people, that persona is the funny one. For others, it's the smart one, or the responsible one. But for a very specific kind of person, the persona becomes something heavier. The reliable one, the strong one, the one who fixes things. At first, this role feels like a gift. You are 12 years old, maybe, and your parents are fighting in the next room. And somehow you become the one who calms your younger sibling down, who makes sure homework gets done, who keeps the house from feeling like it's falling apart. Nobody assigns you this job. You simply notice that if you don't do it, no one will. And a child who notices that will do almost anything to keep the peace. That's the beginning. That's where the emergency contact is born, not as a job title, but as a survival strategy. Here's what almost nobody notices. A child who becomes the family's stabilizer does not grow out of that role. They grow into it. It follows them into friendships, where they become the one everyone vents to, but who never vents back. It follows them into romantic relationships, where they date people who need fixing, because fixing is the only kind of intimacy that ever felt safe. It follows them into their careers, where they become the employee who can't say no, the one who takes on everyone's overflow because refusing feels, on some unconscious level, like abandonment, but this creates another problem. When your entire sense of worth is built on being needed, you unconsciously need people to keep needing you. You are not just the emergency contact. You are, in a strange and unspoken way, dependent on the emergencies. Let that sit for a moment, because it is the first uncomfortable truth in this story. There was a psychologist working in the early 20th century who spent his career studying exactly this kind of hidden architecture, the parts of the psyche we build without knowing we're building them. He proposed that everyone carries a shadow, not evil, not weakness, but the disowned parts of ourselves that we refuse to look at directly. And one of the most common shadows he identified in caretakers, in healers, in the strong ones of every family, was this: a deep, unacknowledged need to be needed. Not because they are selfish, because somewhere very early, being needed was the only proof they had that they were allowed to exist in the room. This is where the wound hides. Not in cruelty, in devotion. Think about the people in your life who are always available, always calm in a crisis. Always the one who says, "Don't worry, I've got this." Have you ever asked yourself what happens to them when nobody needs anything? Have you ever seen what it does to their face in the silence? Most people haven't. because the rescuer has trained everyone around them, without meaning to never ask. Let's talk about a man named Raymond. Not his real name, but his story is real, pieced together from 100 stories that all sound almost identical. Raymond was the oldest of 4 children. His father drank. His mother worked 2 jobs. By the time Raymond was 10, he was making dinner for his younger siblings and lying to his teachers about why his homework wasn't finished. Nobody called this trauma. Everyone called it maturity. By 35, Raymond was the person his entire extended family called first. When a cousin needed bail money, when his mother needed a ride to chemotherapy, when his best friend's marriage was falling apart at midnight. Raymond answered every single call. He prided himself on it. He built a quiet, private religion around the idea that he was the dependable one, the load-bearing wall of every relationship he had. And then, at 39, Raymond had a heart event. Not fatal, but frightening enough that he spent 4 days in a hospital bed. And for the first time in his adult life, his phone did not ring for help. It rang with people asking how he was doing. He described it to a therapist, years later, as the strangest kind of grief he had ever felt. He was surrounded by people who loved him, and he had no idea what to do with their concern. He kept trying to comfort them for being worried about him. He kept apologizing for the inconvenience of his own heart attack. That is what happens when your identity has been built entirely around giving. Receiving feels like a threat. Here's where things become interesting. Because Raymond's story is not actually about generosity. It's about control. And this is the part that stings. So let it sting for a second before we move forward. Being everyone's emergency contact gives you something subtle and seductive, a sense of order in chaos you can't otherwise control. If you are always the calm one in the storm, you never have to be the person falling apart. If you are always solving someone else's crisis, you never have to sit with your own. The rescuer role isn't just about helping others. It's a highly effective, socially praised way of avoiding yourself. This is not a moral failing. This is a psychological structure, and structures like this one are built for a reason. They protect something. Usually they protect a child who once felt that their needs were an inconvenience, and who decided, without ever consciously choosing it, that the safest way to stay loved was to never need anything back. But structures built to protect us in childhood become prisons in adulthood. And prisons, no matter how familiar, eventually make people sick. What happens next surprises almost everyone who lives this pattern. It isn't burnout that breaks the cycle first. It's resentment. Resentment is the shadow's way of finally speaking up. It shows up in small, confusing ways. Irritation at a friend who calls just to vent for the 10th time this month. A flash of anger during a sibling's crisis that makes no sense, given how much you claim to want to help. A heaviness every time your phone buzzes at an odd hour. Most people interpret this resentment as a character flaw. Why am I so bitter about helping the people I love? They ask themselves. And then they punish that thought into silence and keep answering the phone anyway. But resentment is not a character flaw. Resentment is data. It is the psyche's way of telling you that a debt has built up. A debt of self, paid out in installments to everyone except the person who is paying it. This is the part of the story most people never reach, because it requires something almost nobody wants to do. Admitting that the role you're most praised for might be the role that's quietly destroying you. There's a term for what happens to caretakers who never rest, never receive, never let anyone see them struggle. It's called compassion fatigue, and it was first studied seriously among nurses and emergency responders, people whose literal job was to answer crises. What researchers discovered was startling. The symptoms of chronic, unrelieved caretaking looked almost identical to trauma. Numbness, irritability, a creeping cynicism about the very people you're trying to help. A sense that your own emotions have gone quiet, like a radio station that's lost its signal. And here is the twist almost nobody expects. Compassion fatigue does not usually happen to people who don't care enough. It happens to people who care so much for so long, without boundaries, that their nervous system eventually stops being able to tell the difference between someone else's emergency and their own survival. If you have ever felt strangely numb in the middle of comforting someone you love, this is why. Your body has been sounding the alarm for years, and you trained yourself not to hear it because hearing it felt selfish. But here's a question worth sitting with. Who taught you that your own exhaustion was less important than someone else's emergency? Because nobody is born believing that. It is learned, and anything learned can eventually be unlearned. This is where the story usually turns toward hope, and I want to be honest with you. The hope is real, but it comes at a price. The price is grief. To stop being everyone's emergency contact, you have to grieve the identity that role gave you. You have to grieve being the strong one, because strength, when it's your entire personality, is a kind of loneliness dressed up as a compliment. You have to grieve the version of love where being needed and being loved were the same thing, because they were never actually the same thing. Needed is what happens when you are useful. Loved is what happens when you are simply present, useful or not. Most people flinch away from this grief the first time they touch it, because it feels like losing something. But it isn't losing something. It's finally putting something down that was never meant to be carried alone. Carl Jung wrote extensively about a process he called individuation. The lifelong work of becoming who you actually are, underneath every role, every persona, every mask assembled for survival. He believed that until a person consciously faces the parts of themselves they've been avoiding, those parts don't disappear. They simply run the show from backstage, disguised as personality, disguised as virtue, disguised as love. For the emergency contact, individuation means something very specific and very uncomfortable. It means learning to exist without being useful. It means sitting in a room where nobody needs anything from you, and not filling that silence with anxiety. It means, for the first time, asking what you actually want. A question that can feel almost physically strange to a person who has spent decades answering everyone else's questions first. This is the moment the video promised you at the beginning, the day everything looks different, and it rarely looks like a dramatic turning point. It looks like something small, a phone call you don't answer, a crisis you let someone else solve. A friend who is disappointed in you for the first time because you said the sentence you've never said before. I can't right now. That sentence feels like betrayal the first time you say it. It is not betrayal. It is the beginning of a self. Let's talk about what actually happens biologically and psychologically when a lifelong rescuer sets their first real boundary. There is a term for the discomfort that follows. The guilt that floods in, even when the boundary is completely reasonable. Psychologists sometimes call it the extinction burst, the sharp, painful spike in anxiety that occurs right before an old pattern finally begins to weaken. It feels in the moment like proof that you're doing something wrong. In reality, it's proof that something old is finally losing its grip. Most people quit right here. The guilt feels so unbearable, so unfamiliar, that they answer the next call just to make the discomfort stop, and the pattern resets, stronger than before, because now the psyche has learned that boundaries lead to unbearable feelings, so best to avoid them altogether. But the people who push through that first wave of guilt discover something nobody warned them about. The guilt doesn't actually mean they did something wrong. It means they interrupted a role that other people had quietly come to depend on. And other people depending on your self-erasure is not the same thing as those people loving you. Sometimes it's simply comfort, mistaken for connection. This is where the story gets harder before it gets better, because setting boundaries with people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will cost you something real. Some relationships will not survive your becoming a whole person instead of a role. That is a painful, honest fact, and no video should promise you otherwise. But here is what almost nobody tells you about those losses. The relationships that end when you stop over-functioning were never built on you as a person. They were built on your function. And a relationship built on function instead of self was never fully real to begin with. It was a transaction wearing the costume of intimacy. The relationships that survive your boundaries, those are the real ones, and you will not know which is which until you test it, which is precisely why so many rescuers spend their entire lives avoiding the test altogether. It's safer to assume everyone loves you than to risk discovering some of them only loved what you did for them. There's a story, often told in psychology circles, about the archetype of the wounded healer. The idea, dating back to ancient myth, that the most powerful healers are often those who carry their own unhealed wound quietly beneath their gift. The physician who cannot fully cure himself, yet through that very wound, understands suffering deeply enough to help others survive it. Jung leaned heavily on this image throughout his work, because he believed that the shadow, the very thing we're most ashamed of, often contains the seed of our greatest capacity to help. But there is a dark twin to the wounded healer, and almost nobody talks about this twin. It's the healer who never turns inward, who spends an entire lifetime tending everyone else's wound while their own festers, untouched, hidden behind decades of usefulness. Eventually, that untended wound doesn't just hurt the healer. It starts to hurt everyone they're trying to help, because a person operating from an unhealed place cannot help but transmit some of that unhealed energy into every rescue they perform. This is uncomfortable to hear if you are the rescuer in your family, your friend group, your workplace. But it is also, strangely, freeing, because it means the most loving thing you can do for the people who depend on you is not to keep showing up broken. It's to finally, quietly, begin repairing yourself, even if that means showing up less. Here is the insight almost nobody arrives at until very late in this journey. Your usefulness was never actually the thing people loved about you. It was the thing that made you easiest to love, because it required nothing risky from them. It required no vulnerability, no reciprocity, no uncomfortable conversations about what you might need in return. People will always prefer a version of you that only gives. The question is whether you are willing to keep disappearing to remain preferred. There's another layer to this that rarely gets discussed, and it has less to do with childhood and more to do with culture, because the rescuer role is not distributed evenly across every life. It tends to fall hardest on the person, in any family or friend group, who is quietly labeled the strong one, and that label is almost never a compliment offered freely. It's a job assignment disguised as praise. Think about the language itself. "You're so strong. I don't know how you do it. You always know what to say." These sentences sound like admiration, but listen closely, and you'll hear something else underneath them. Relief. Relief that someone else is carrying the weight, so nobody else has to. Every time someone tells the rescuer how strong they are, what they are really saying, without meaning to, is, "Please keep doing this so I don't have to." This is how an entire family system, an entire friend group, an entire workplace can quietly outsource its emotional labor onto one person. Not through cruelty, but through convenience. And the rescuer accepts the job, because the alternative, refusing it, feels like disappointing everyone who has come to depend on them. Nobody sits down and negotiates this arrangement. It simply calcifies, year after year, phone call after phone call, until it feels less like a role and more like a law of nature. Here's an unexpected fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. Researchers studying caregiver burnout have found that the people most at risk of collapse are not the ones who care the least about boundaries. They're the ones with the strongest internal compass for right and wrong. People who feel a near physical discomfort at the thought of letting someone down. Their conscience, the very thing that makes them so dependable, is the same mechanism that keeps them trapped. A weaker sense of duty would have let them walk away years ago. It's precisely their integrity that keeps them chained to the role. This is why guilt-tripping a rescuer rarely even needs to be intentional. Their own conscience will do the guilt-tripping for you, long after everyone else has gone quiet. Now, here's where the psychology gets genuinely strange and worth sitting with for a moment. There is a concept called projection, the tendency to unconsciously place a part of yourself onto someone else, usually a part you can't yet face directly. Rescuers, without realizing it, often project their own unmet need for care onto the very people they are trying to save. When Raymond drove across town at midnight for a friend in crisis, some part of him was not only comforting his friend, some part of him was comforting the version of himself who, as a boy, had nobody driving across town for him. This doesn't make the help fake. The help is real, the compassion is real, the late-night drive is real. But underneath it, a second, quieter transaction is happening. The rescuer is trying to give someone else the thing they never received, hoping, somewhere beneath conscious awareness, that giving it away enough times might finally heal the place where it's missing in themselves. It never does. That's the tragic mechanics of it. You cannot heal an old absence by filling someone else's present. The wound doesn't close by proxy. It only closes when it's finally faced directly, by the person who's carrying it. There's relief in understanding this, even though it doesn't feel like relief at first. It means the compulsive rescuing was never really about weakness of character. It was a brilliant, if exhausting, strategy, a child's ingenious attempt to turn helplessness into usefulness, danger into duty, absence into purpose. It worked. That's the part worth honoring before anything else. It worked long enough to get you here. The tragedy is only that a strategy built for survival was never designed to be a way of life. Somewhere in every rescuer's life, there is a version of themselves who never learned to ask for help. Not because help wasn't available, but because asking felt like handing someone a weapon. If you show people your need, they can reject it. If you never show it, you're safe, but you're also alone, in the exact way you've always secretly feared. The armor and the wound are the same thing, worn so long they've fused together. The day you stop being everyone's emergency contact does not happen because you stop caring. It happens because you finally start caring about the one person you were trained, from childhood, to leave out of the equation, yourself. And here is the final, strongest insight, the one worth waiting for. The people who transform this pattern do not become cold. They do not become the opposite of who they were, distant and unavailable. Something quieter and far more powerful happens instead. Their care becomes a choice instead of a compulsion. And chosen care, unlike compulsive rescuing, does not drain a person. It nourishes both sides of the relationship because it is offered freely, not extracted by guilt or fear or old survival wiring. This is the real transformation. Not becoming someone who no longer helps, becoming someone who helps from fullness instead of from fear. Someone whose yes actually means something, because it now sits beside a no that is equally real. If you recognize yourself anywhere in this story, in Raymond's hospital bed, in the resentment you've never let yourself name, in the phone calls you answer while your own chest is quietly caving in, I want you to hear this clearly. You were never selfish for wanting to be cared for, too. You were only ever taught, very early and very convincingly, that your needs were the one emergency nobody was coming for. That was never true. It was only ever the story a frightened child told themselves to survive a house that couldn't hold everyone's needs at once. You are not that child anymore. You do not have to keep running the same rescue, decade after decade. For people who were never actually in danger of losing you, only in danger of finally having to meet you as a whole person instead of a role. There's one more piece of this that deserves to be said plainly, because most people skip past it in their hurry to reach a happy ending. Becoming someone who no longer answers every emergency does not happen in a single dramatic moment, no matter how satisfying that would be to watch. It happens in small, unglamorous repetitions, It happens the second time you say no, when the guilt is slightly quieter than the first time. It happens the fifth time, when you notice you slept through the night without your phone under your pillow. It happens the 20th time, when a friend calls with a crisis you know they are fully capable of solving themselves, and instead of rushing in, you simply ask, "What do you think you should do?" And you wait, uncomfortably, humanly, for them to find their own answer. This is not coldness. This is one of the most loving things a rescuer can ever do, because it finally treats the people around them as capable adults instead of fragile dependents who need constant rescuing to survive. Ironically, the people who complain the loudest when a rescuer sets a boundary are often the ones who grow the most once that boundary holds, because for the first time, they are forced to develop the very muscle the rescuer had been, unconsciously atrophying in them for years, the muscle of handling their own life. There is a kind of humility hidden inside this shift that nobody warns you about. Stepping back from the rescuer role means admitting that you were never actually the only person who could hold things together. It means admitting that your usefulness, as vast as it felt, was never quite as irreplaceable as your identity needed it to be. That can feel like a small death. It is, in a sense, but it is also the death of an illusion, not of your worth. And those are two very different kinds of loss, even though they feel identical in the moment. The day you stop being everyone's emergency contact is not the day you stop loving people. It is the day you finally, quietly, become someone worth loving back. If this changed the way you see yourself or someone you love, stay close, because the next lesson goes even deeper than this one, and it might be the one you've been needing the most.